Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of a few recent pieces of fiction. So the first thing I'm going to mention possibly doesn't belong in a list of fiction because it does feel more autobiographical, but I'm going to throw it in here because it felt a little bit iffy to throw it on with the nonfiction. And that was Farzana Doctor's You Still Look the Same. I listened to the audio version of this, which is read by the author with one actor in there to fill in a couple of roles. So this is a collection of poetry that is, I would say, fairly accessible. It feels almost like flash fiction or micro short stories, more than it does like poetry, which is why, because it had that short story feel, that is why I decided to throw it in with the fiction here. If you've read her novels, a lot of this poetry feels almost like a shout out to certain bits and pieces in some of them, both in terms of, is it in Seven, where she has the midlife crisis bits and the discussion of female genital cutting in the Bora community, and if you've read All Inclusive, a kind of discussion about how ethnic stereotypes work in small town Ontario, things like that. Most of her books are not specifically autobiographical, often they're very clearly not. Like 6 Meters of Pavement, which is my favorite of her novels, is very clearly very different, but at the same time has elements that are reflected in some of the poetry that feel like this mixing of autobiography and flash fiction. So I thought this was kind of interesting. I did not, to be honest, enjoy this as much as I usually enjoy her novels, which is almost kind of funny because I feel like there are a lot of authors whose poetry I really enjoy, and I don't usually enjoy their prose writing quite as much, and this was clearly the opposite. I really enjoy most of her novels. This was just kind of okay. Although I do wonder, because they do feel more like short stories than poetry, I wonder if this would have been better served by having an actor performing the pieces. Because I usually say with autobiography, I would rather have the author reading it themselves, and often with poetry too, if it's rhythm-based, because then you get a sense of the tempo that they are imagining when they write it. But because this felt more like stories, it felt like maybe these should have been performed more than recited. But I don't know. Next up, I have another piece of Canadian writing, and this is The Wrong Side of the Court by Hahn. I saw this writer talk about his writing process during Fold, the Festival of Literary Diversity. And as you know, most of the time if I'm reading a kid's book, and this is a young adult novel, it is because it is about either war or sports, and this is a sports story. The main character in this is a boy who's trying to get on his high school basketball team and trying to get a girlfriend. And I would say a lot of the sports stuff is a lot of fun. A lot of the neighborhood descriptions are pretty good. This is set in Toronto. And one of the things that it's playing with is that the kid who's the main character lives in public housing in Regent Park, and the girl that he's trying to get with lives in Cabbagetown, which is basically exactly the same area, but is the far more wealthy area. And so some of it is talking about how these neighborhoods are very right next to each other. Now, some of it is a little overdone, like he's saying, where else but Regent Park would you have the public housing next to the multi-million-dollar house? I'm like, yes, we have that in Scarborough too. Like, that's not unusual in the Toronto area. Or he'll say things like, where else but Regent Park will you hear 17 languages between your house and school? It's like, yes, that's true in Scarborough too. Like, it's not unique to there. But again, this is a narrator who's a teenager, so, you know, complaining that the teenage character doesn't have the correct demographic information for the rest of the Toronto area is silly. I'm not really nitpicking at that. It just was something I thought as I read it. In any case, I thought this was paced quite well, and I think it, for specifically a teenage audience, it does a good job at poking at a lot of the assumptions that kids come in with the idea of, okay, these people have certain benefits or certain levels of innate athleticism or are rich enough to afford this or that. And it's sort of the flip side, because this is a kid's book where you're going to assume there's a moral to the story. It's almost the flip side of the Running to Beijing that I talked about a while ago, where you have characters who don't have particularly good choices, but they're making the worst of 3 bad choices. And this is kind of the reverse, the inspirational side of that kind of thing, where he's like, okay, you may not have the great choices of person A and B, but you can make these better choices and that kind of thing. And it has some funny things in terms of not being able to make bad choices that you might have made. Like, one of the things that the character is always talking about is he has a friend, the brother of one of his friends is shot in a gang-related incident, And he's in a position where maybe some teachers or coaches would say, good for you for staying out of gangs, when in reality it's just because he's from an ethnic background that doesn't have any gangs in his particular region. And because that's what they're based on, it's kind of giving him credit that it wasn't really a choice to begin with and things like that. I don't know. I thought this was a lot of fun just in being a kind of local product. It's very Toronto-y. I think I've mentioned this when I've talked about this in a tag video, and that is that for people who are shopping for school libraries and such, the kids in this swear, and they swear all the time, which is very realistic because, one, teenagers, I think, in general swear a lot. Also, people in Toronto swear a lot. This was something I noticed when I lived in the US, that people do not swear nearly as much. So there is a lot of strong language in that, and I know that that has turned off. I saw some reviews online specifically from people who are stalking school librarians, especially when they're at K-12 schools or schools that have a religious affiliation, and where there would be more potential parental backlash on that. And I think that's a shame, because I think the language does make this a lot more realistic than a lot of books for this age range would be. So it's both a pro and a con in that I think it's going to keep this book out of certain private school libraries, but at the same time I think it's something that I wish we would see more in books aimed for this audience, because genuinely it feels unrealistic in a lot of settings, and this doesn't do that. Next up, I'll talk about a couple of books that are part of my project where I'm reading books in both the original and the English translation, because I have become really cynical about the choices translators have been making, thanks mostly to the Booktube Prize books. So this is Kaouther Adimi's Nos Richesses, or Our Riches, which is a book that is very short. This looks longer, but it's because the print is huge. And this is a book that's set basically in 3 periods of Algerian history: in the Second World War, during the Independence War, and then during the Civil War, much more recently. And it's centered around the real-life bookstore that was owned by Edmond Charlotte, who had the publisher and wrote a lot of the famous Algerian and Algerian-based French authors of his era were connected to him, and so some of this is his letters. The issue that I had with this book is that despite how short it is, this took forever to read because it is boring, and it shouldn't be boring. Given this 3-war setting, and given, this is BookTube, clearly I'm a book nerd, so this should be appealing. This was dull. And it stylistically, I love stuff that jumps back and forth in time and has some things that are character narrations and some things that are letters and something. Stylistically, this is the kind of thing I normally like. This was dull. It was dull, also dull in both languages. And what's really shocking about this is I've seen interviews with Adimi, and she's great. Watching her talk about this book is much more fun than reading this book. I mean, she's in her 30s, but this book genuinely kind of feels like it was written by somebody who was saying, kids these days don't read anymore. Because that's sort of what the most recent set of timelines in there is about. This young guy who'd been studying in France is back in Algeria, and he's trying to give away these books as they're renovating the bookstore that had become a library that's being decommissioned. And so he's getting rid of books, and he can't get people to take them, and some of them are getting rained on, and there's a lot of this. And it does have this real grumpy old man feeling that when you think about how is it that a woman in her 30s wrote this grumpy old man book, especially because the interviews where she's talking about this book are so great, and then the book itself is boring. So yeah, I guess I'll say that the English translation, which was done by, Chris Andrews, is very true to the original, because it is also really boring. If you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen that this has been in my car for a couple of months, because normally I start a book in my car because I'm waiting for something, like I'm waiting to go into the dog training center, or I'm waiting to go into a restaurant or something, or waiting to go get coffee, and then I take it with me to finish. And I have never wanted to take it with me to finish, so it just stayed in my car until I finally got through the whole thing. Dull. And it shouldn't be dull. I don't know. If you have read that, I would love to hear if you found it more engaging than I did, because, I mean, it won prizes. I don't know. All right, and finally, I read Saša Stanišić's Herkunft, or Where You Come From. Sadly, I was trying to take a pretty picture for Instagram, and I dropped this in the Rouge River. So I don't know if you can appreciate how warped these pages are. So this smells weird. I'm going to have to recycle the English translation, which is by Damion Searls, once I'm done with this, because it no longer smells good. So this is a work of autofiction. It is about a character who is basically Saša Stanišić, who was born in 1978 in what's now Bosnia, what was Yugoslavia, and his father was a Serb and his mother was a Bosniak, so the 90s were not a great time for families such as his, so they moved to Germany. His parents eventually got deported, but he stayed because he was able to stay because he was a student at the time. So it follows the story of his life, but it's also interwoven with a more, not exactly current, but a more modern day piece where his grandmother back home has dementia and doesn't know who people are or what year it is or what's happening. And so when we get to the end, so then we have an end section that is a choose your own adventure fantasy, sort of, except it's essentially engaging in a fantasy with the grandmother with dementia at the end. And that's interesting. I've seen a number of people who thought that was the best part of this book. I personally didn't. I actually enjoyed the normal part of it more, although I appreciated kind of the build up to it, because there are enough references to things like choose your own adventure stories or to the grandmother not really existing in the real world anymore. And so as a concept and as a flow, I thought that worked really well. And what was interesting in this kind of translation experiment is that while the translation is fairly loyal to the text, it sometimes takes, and I've talked about Daniel Hahn's Catching Fire translation journal a while ago, and how he talks about thinking that subtitles are giving up, and he would always rather translate something. And that is what the translator does here, to a level that I think doesn't work. For example, there's a point, and it's the 90s, and so the main character / the author is out with his friends, and they are called an ethnic slur. If you speak German, you know the one. It starts with a K. And the translator in English turns that into a slur for Italians. Starts with a W. You presumably know which one I mean. And the thing is, so Stanišić and I are about the same age. And I'm going to say, I don't think that that word has the same punch to it, or is an accurate reflection of what the original German was. And I think he shouldn't have, and I think the translator shouldn't have translated that. They should have used the original word and maybe had a footnote or an endnote or something that explained that. And there are a couple other points in it where I thought the translator doesn't think you, the Anglophone reader, knows anything. There's one line where when they're about to move to Germany, and the line is that the only German he knows is Lothar Matthäus, right? The footballer. But it doesn't need to say that, because the text assumes that you know who he is. But the English translation says basically, the only German I know is Lothar Matthäus, the soccer player in parentheses. And I just thought, you don't need to specify that. Like, if your reader doesn't know who he is, they can Google that, one. Two, I feel like anybody who watches any kind of coverage of international soccer, like, knows who Lothar Matthäus is. So I just thought, and there were a few points in there where I thought, this is over-translated. Like, give your audience some respect. There are also a few places where there's like alliteration in the original that is lost in the English because the translator is going for meaning over style, which, is a choice that translators have to make. And I don't know if that's always the best choice, but that is the choice that's going on here. So I did feel like the translator is holding the English language reader's hand more than they needed to. But I don't know. So I don't know how I feel about that. Like, it's not a translation where I think there's a lie. It's not, there are all kinds of translations where you see mistakes. But see, and as I'm saying that, maybe I'm giving the reader too much credit, because I remember, I can't remember his name now, but the translator who did the French translation of Roxanne Gay's Ayiti, he left there were bits in that were Haitian Creole, which he left in his French translation. And this translator is a Haitian Canadian. I saw an interview with him where he was saying this was him as a Haitian Canadian leaving in the Creole that was written by the Haitian American. And when that book was reviewed in France, people were accusing him of leaving in Quebecois, and it wasn't Quebecois, it was Haitian Creole. But if your reader doesn't understand that that's what they're getting, do you have to explain that more? So maybe it's not, so maybe I'm giving the reader too much credit that they would recognize something like that. I don't know. I would be curious to hear your opinion, especially if you read things if you've ever chosen to read either multiple translations of something. I'd be curious to hear what you think, whether you've read the original and the translation of something, if you do it frequently especially, or if you've just read different versions, different translations of the same work. I'd be curious to hear your preferences in terms of that kind of thing. Anyway, that's it for now. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought, especially about the translation stuff. So yeah, ciao.